enemy fortress was an old, abandoned house deep in a wooded area that was conveniently located next to a large neighborhood. This house, with worn wooden shingles on its top and sides, some which were missing, stood as the only sign of civilization there in the woods. Kids from the neighborhood playing army would find various ways to assault the imaginary enemy that was in the house, but never entered the house itself. The house was locked up and the windows were boarded somewhat up. The inside of the house's interior appeared to be in very bad condition. Its floors looked like they could collapse with any step, at least from what the little boys could actually see through the missing boards. The adults of the neighborhood were wary of the woods surrounding the old house. There were rumors about the woods, about places for criminals to hide, strange vagabonds that might inhabit there, or even sightings of spirits now and again. It was customary to always give a clear warning to adventurous boys who liked to use the woods as an adventure land not to stray too far in, due to the harm and injury that could occur, or though seldom mentioned, to avoid any unpleasant encounters. It is with this background our story begins. Todd and his friend Curtis had equipped themselves with all of the counter-espionage equipment that they had and started out the door. Each had some type of make-believe assault rifle and hand grenade. Tom had his father's binoculars, and Curtis had a hunting knife. It was Halloween, and the boys were going out for one quick mission to assault the empty fortress before dark, after which they would come back to the neighborhood and start their candy gathering campaign. The ground in the woods they entered was dotted with patches of leaves that covered pine needles that existed everywhere else. As they approached the old house, they noticed again how many dead trees were standing about, with some lying across the ground where they had fallen years ago. Todd crouched down behind a tree trunk, and Curtis followed him to this surveillance position. He grabbed a hand grenade, better known as a medium-sized rock, and, staying in a semi-crouched position, walked up to within throwing distance of the house. The trick was to get the hand grenade through one of the few openings in the boards covering the windows. Otherwise, it would bounce back and you would lose the element of surprise. Curtis again followed Todd as he got closer to the house and watched him as he carefully tossed the grenade at the small opening. The rock struck 2 boards away from the opening and ricocheted up, hitting the porch ceiling as well, before tumbling to the porch itself. The boys then knew the surprise was spoiled, so Curtis raised his toy assault rifle and began spraying the house with imaginary bullets via full auto fire. After a few exchanges of firefighting between the terrorists in the house and the 2 boys, the terrorists were now mostly all dead. As the 2 boys began to close in on the fortress, Curtis noticed a surviving terrorist sneaking up on them. Drawing his knife, he took it by the blade, as he had seen in the movies, and threw the knife at him. Instead of hitting the terrorist, or better, embedding its blade into the house, the knife flew straight through the opening that Todd had tried to get his rock through and bounced across the floor inside. Curtis ran up to the opening to look in. Todd ran up beside him and began to strain his vision to see if he could help find where the knife went. The room they were looking in had broken pieces of furniture and other odds and ends that made it difficult to make out what was in there. Besides that, the sun was setting and it was getting noticeably darker. They desperately contemplated on what to do, as there was no way inside the house. The board Curtis was holding onto as he looked in suddenly pulled off the window, causing Curtis to almost fall on his back. Todd then gathered another board and began pulling, and with little effort was able to remove a second board and produce an opening big enough to crawl through. Todd suggested they could wait till tomorrow, but Curtis insisted on trying to get it, and he began climbing through the window. Todd admonished Curtis to be careful as Curtis rested his feet on the floor and began to walk towards where he thought he saw the knife. The floor made loud creaking sounds each time Curtis took a step, and the room was getting darker by the minute. Todd asked Curtis how it was even possible to see anything in there. Curtis replied that he seized the knife, which caused Todd to again admonish him to grab it and get out of there. The room was now too dark to see where Curtis was, and Todd again asked if he had the knife, but there was silence. Todd listened briefly and asked again, somewhat louder, if he had the knife. Again, silence. Todd could feel his heart racing inside his chest as he vainly looked into the dark room. There was no sound at all in the house, no footsteps, no creaking wood, nothing but dead silence. In desperation, Todd called out Curtis as loud as he could, but he did not hear even an echo back. Todd then decided to go for help and turned to go, but his foot would not move. It appeared to be stuck on the porch, or was something holding onto his foot. Todd immediately let out a scream and tried even harder to release his foot, but to no avail. Todd screamed again and began looking down in the dim light, where he noticed that his foot had stepped into a missing area of a plank on the porch and was wedged in the hole that was there. He frantically sat down on the porch, grabbed his foot with both hands, and started pulling, but his shoe was not getting loose. It was at this point that Todd suddenly heard something moving in the woods, footsteps crunching the dead leaves nearby. Todd's fright then redoubled as he began crying, still struggling with his shoe, until he collected his thoughts enough to untie his shoe and remove his foot from it. With his foot free, Todd sprang up to his feet and ran as fast as he could away from the house and away from where he heard footsteps. He soon reached his house and burst inside, hollering loudly that Curtis was missing. After his parents calmed him down somewhat, Todd chronicled what had happened and begged his dad to go back there with him. Todd's dad grabbed a flashlight while Todd put on another pair of shoes, and the two began sprinting towards the old house. The two sprinted through the woods for some time until they reached the area the old house was in. The near full moon lit the area to the degree that a flashlight was not really necessary. Todd recognized the dead trees that were about the house, the same tree trunks he and Curtis would hide behind. But the house was gone. Todd felt panic and fear well up inside him, his dad showing bewilderment and concern as Todd swore this was where the house was. Todd and his dad slowly walked up to where the house stood and noticed a stone foundation of the house was there, along with a few broken pieces of wood scattered about. Todd began walking over the ground where the house's interior was, and found Curtis's knife, then bent down to pick it up. The knife Todd held was crusted with rust and the wooden handle partially rotted away. Todd's father noticed that this knife had been there for a long time and couldn't have belonged to Curtis. Todd protested that it was exactly the same knife. Then, remembering his missing shoe, walked over to where the porch was. There, half buried in the ground, lay his shoe. Todd's father shined his light on the shoe Todd was pointing at, and he recognized it as belonging to his son. Todd reached down to pick it up, but the top of the shoe came apart from the bottom, and the part he had picked up was torn and fragile. Todd's father reached over and took the shoe fragment from Todd and exclaimed that it showed wear like it has been there for a very long time. like the knife. The two quickly returned home and contacted Curtis's parents and the sheriff, who began a wide area search for Curtis. To this day, however, Curtis has never been found, although Todd still continues to search for him. Many nights, especially on Halloween, Todd will revisit the site of the old house, but never saw it again. Some nights, Todd can faintly make out footsteps like he heard the night he was trapped on the porch. And he believes now, somehow, they might be the footsteps of Curtis trying to get back from wherever that might be. Todd is haunted by the thought that it might have been Curtis's footsteps that night rather than belonging to something trying to get him. If so, Todd's heart now sinks at the thought he might have abandoned him when he ran away. It does now seem, however, that whether he will see Curtis or if anyone will ever see that house again will remain a mystery. Todd's children now play outside games with their friends, but are forbidden to go into the woods at all. But other children do visit the woods, and the house might still be there for them. So on Halloween night, if you see an old, run-down, deserted house that looks haunted, you would best stay away, for the spirit that haunts the house might be your own.